Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. This and more we expect from our leaders. And now here's Reverend Sue.
Got joy in my soul. God is in control. I got Satan on my trail, but I'm singing all is well. He's attacking every day, but I'm watching while I pray. No matter the attack, I won't turn back.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are excited again. I mean, we have been so blessed to have the best guests, I think, throughout the social media. And again, we have a great person. Someone I'm very fond of. I see him doing so many things that are so important for us as a people, as well as in this country, as well as also the whole world. That Dr. Marquis Ball is the interim president of Maple Springs Baptist Bible College and Seminary and lead pastor of Uplift Church located in Maryland. He's a graduate of Howard University Divinity School, where he received his Master of Divinity. And he's also received a Doctor of Education Ministry from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. In 2021, the Board of Trustees of Maple Springs Baptist Bible College and Seminary, under the leadership of Chairman Rogers Davis, appointed Dr. Ball as interim president effective January of this year. He has served as a professor of Black church history. He's also the Washington, D.C. Bureau Religious and Education Affairs liaison for the National Action Network, the first vice president of the Maryland State Convention of Progressive Baptist Churches, vice president of the operations of the 100 Black Men of Prince George's County, and vice president of the Sigma Alpha Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Inc. He's committed to the call of God on his life. And everything he does, you will know that it's just a demonstration of that's the true statement. And it's cited as God continued to do so many great things in his life and his ministry. He is married to Sabrina Ball, and they have 4 children, Ryan, Michael, Nathan, and Kristen. Dr. Ball, I'm telling you, I know how busy you are, and I appreciate the time that you've taken just to spend some moments with us to talk about some critical issues relating to our community, to our students who are now at your university and other universities, and how they are being equipped, prepared to go out now and deal with issues that are not tomorrow and not before, but right now in our community, things that are happening every single day. I thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure.
And also, so we talk about, Dr. Ball, we're talking about, all you can hear is CRT. I am so absolutely crazy when it comes to CRT. And CRT, they blame it for everything, like books now are not going into classrooms, certain classroom, the curriculum, but CRT is not even talked about in the classroom. Okay, so it's a broad statement, CRT.
Correct.
So I want to go back to liberation theology.
Sure.
From that, because I think about James Corn and others, that if what separate the liberation theology from other method of Christian teaching? What's separated? Because if you don't mind.
Great question. So I'll try to address kind of both positions. One, CRT, critical race theory, is just that it's theory. And normally in primary schools, theory is not necessarily addressed. It came from a law school kind of conversation. The fear with critical race theory or teaching of race, particularly for some in the dominant culture or the dominant population currently, is that the narrative that has been told will be replaced with more of a balanced or truthful narrative. There is something called Plato's allegory of the cave, where it kind of describes what it must be like for someone to live in a particular setting that they thought was true. And that's the only truth that they've known. If they are removed from that setting and put into a different setting, what they thought was true is uprooted, those people will clamor to go back into the cave for the truth that they had accepted. So some are concerned that the narratives, for example, that Christopher Columbus discovered America. No, Christopher Columbus was a drunk sailor and landed somewhere because he was lost. But that's not the narrative that they've told. And so the concern is, as more truth is being described, that their narrative is uprooted. When it comes to liberation theology, or the works of James Cone, the same is true. So when one culture dominates the narrative, they set the standards. So, for example, in theology, there are the accepted principles, the scientific method. In order to be a deep theologian, you have to reference German or French thinkers. So for the European culture, the Western culture, slave narratives or slave songs isn't considered theology because it's not written in some huge tome. And so therefore they would dismiss that. The narrative of the slave preacher or the sermons of the slave preacher, they dismiss. Whereas James Cone would pick this up and say, this is theology. This is how Black people approach their relationship with God. And in larger cultures, that's not credited. I'll give another example. While at Southern Seminary, I was taking Black church leadership for the 21st century. That was my doctoral kind of lane. Southern offers many doctoral kind of focuses. So I'm staying in what was called commuter housing because I really want to interact with the other students. It was a predominantly white campus. And while we were there, it was only doctoral students. And I would ask, well, which program are you in? They would say, I'm in a doctorate focused on theology or family ministry or music, whatever their doctoral lane was. And they would ask me, what's mine? And my response was Black church leadership. One guy built up the courage one morning to ask me, why Black church leadership and not just church leadership? And I walked with him and I said, here's why. For one, your question suggests that there is only one perspective. And so I said, I'm going to mention some names of leading preachers for you, and you tell me if you heard of them. So I would say Gardner C. Taylor, Sammy DeWitt Proctor, or Jarena Lee. And I just went through the list, and he'd never heard of them. I said, I know all of your great white preachers, but you know none of the leading Black preachers or great luminaries in Black preaching. I said, because for you, white is normative and others don't exist. So one of the challenges with critical race theory and liberation theology is it brings to the front a different perspective than the normative white perspective.
And okay, this is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about a lot of things. The right-wing conservatives have grabbed critical race theory as a political wage issue. Okay, so we have churches, social media, and our homes available, teaching all these avenues that we can use today. So going back to students and going back to our community again, I'm always talking about the Black church and our responsibility to teach our children about really what's going on. Exactly what you said. We teach them in social media. We teach them in our churches. We teach them at a recreational center. We have to do that because we would keep following and keep following and keep following behind, and we never get to the point that we are standing still and say, okay, let us take a breath. Let us take a breath now, because we have the information. But what can you offer as a president of a university, as a pastor, as an activist in so many different things relating to to Black liberation theology? What can you tell us today, and really tell us about not following? We constantly, people control language, they control words. So what can we do that we have this information? We know songs were part of theology. We know that. We know they sung in the woods and they prayed and all this. What can we do now as a people to correct some of the things that we have not been doing?
That's a great question. So in education, we are taught education philosophy. So that's something I had to study and write about to describe my own philosophy of education. My philosophy is one of reconstruction. So my mentor, Dr. Joseph Evans, currently the Dean of Morehouse School of Religion. Dr. Evans' first book is called Lifting the Veil Over Eurocentrism, a Du Boisian hermeneutic, keyword, Du Boisian hermeneutic of double consciousness. Let me try to break this down. Hermeneutic really deals with the lens through which a person interprets a thing. So he's writing that, and it's a dense book, but he's writing it really to thought leaders to say, we have to have a different interpretive lens at the beginning. Our point of departure has to be different at the beginning. So for me, as a Reconstruction thinker, I'm of the mindset that we have to be in position to tell a different story. I use Christopher Columbus as an example. The story that Christopher Columbus discovered America will remain that way unless someone with a different lens tells that story. If a Native American writes that story, it is not that he discovered anything, because that Native American's people were already here. So they're not going to write it in that way because their lens is different. The same is true for African Americans. When we read the Bible, when we do theology or biblical interpretation, our lens has to be our own. When we have been so shaped by the evangelical approach to to biblical interpretation, and the Western scientific method, which ignores any other approaches to scripture, then we are still shaped by their lens and by their narrative, by what they consider as quote unquote right. They're still the measuring rod. Until we break free and become our own measuring rod. So how we preach, our norm is we're taught the introduction, 3 points, and the conclusion, which is more of the Aristotelian kind of logic structure, because that's a Western approach. And if you don't do that, then something is wrong with you and with your preaching. If you are writing a book, and if you don't credit white sources, then something is less than and weaker about your publications. So we have to begin to own our own narrative, and we have to begin to tell our own story and not be as concerned about the acceptance of the dominant culture measuring us, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That really makes sense. And you talk about double consciousness. there are your pastors, and then also at universities, you don't just have Blacks, you don't have just people of color, you have other races of people who actually are part of your congregation and are part of your schools. So with that, I definitely, I think that's important, because you cannot have fear to do it. Mm-hmm. If you have fear, you would not be able to do it. Right. You have to do if you preach the Bible, really preach the Bible, then you will be good with doing it. If you preach the Bible, because liberation theology is definitely, to me, it's the Bible. So I was just, because sometimes we in the urban community, maybe rural community as well, that we hold back. I think sometimes we hold back from teaching. We hold back from what we say because we don't want to offend. We don't want to offend your congregation. You don't want to offend your community. So with that, thank you for reminding us that we still have work to do. We can't, God is not fear. So we have to be able to express ourselves and tell the story, tell the truth, tell our history.
So yes. let me share this perspective with the idea of being offensive. I think we ought to turn that some and recognize that we offend our own community when we allow someone else telling us to be silent to influence us. Mm-hmm. So I remember when I was in the Air Force, I had to do a prayer. They asked me to do a prayer, and I had to write it out and get it approved by the chaplain. And I was told that I could not say in Jesus' name because it may be offensive. And I said, well, to not say it is offensive then to me. And what they weren't realizing is we're okay with your being offended. Mm-hmm. We don't want to offend others. So as African Americans in our own context, we've got to recognize we should not be ashamed of who we are. We should not be ashamed to proudly tell our own story, or not just African Americans, any other culture that is not the dominant culture. We've got to begin to recognize that. I give this example when I teach Black church history, and particularly when I get to the part about just our West African kind of lineage and history. I start with this. I say, do you all know who Thor is? And they say, yes. Do you know who Poseidon is? They say, yes. And I say, what about Zeus? They say, yes. And then I began to mention Orishas and Shango, and they've never heard of these. And many are offended when they hear about the African deities. And I say, it's interesting because the European deities you've seen in movies, and you begin to value that as something higher and richer. It was just as demonic because it wasn't biblical, but you are offended by your own history. So we've got to begin to turn that narrative more.
I experienced a student a while back when I was in the divinity school, and we had the Black church, course on the Black church. And the student came in and he said, well, I don't think we should have, there's no reason to have a course relating to the Black church. And I admired the professor because the professor said, and that was way back when we didn't have Uber at the time. Mm-hmm. So he said, anytime that this Black man is standing up with a $1,500 suit on, and he had the best leather briefcase you can buy, and the cab passes him and go to the white man, okay, we need Black church. Mm-hmm. And that was, you have an opportunity to stay here or you have an opportunity to be here. But I always tell that story because at that point he was Black, but he said we don't need the Black church. And I was really excited when she explained, yes, we do need Black history. We do need Black church. And thank you for teaching, at the university, at your college, preparing the student, preparing them over and over again to not just take this in, but go out and act upon it. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So when you talk about, again, by students, what do you see? What do you see now when we're graduating from the divinity school, we're graduating from the seminaries as Blacks? What do you see that is really missing? This is and things are happening today while you're a student, and then when you graduate. What do you expect of these students to do?
Great question. I've been shaped by the perspective that one must have a voice in the public square. So there are a lot of people who have degrees, masters, doctorates, and have no voice in the public square, which means they don't weigh in on the issues of the day. I think it's important that we have our own voice in the public square, and we have to have a voice that is not battling on the major bookends that I would say. You've got the liberal bookend and the conservative bookend. You've got evangelicals and progressives. And from my perspective, at least, those are both white arguments that is not necessarily true for the Black narrative. So I think we have to make sure we're having a voice in the public square that speaks to our issues for our people. So when George Floyd is murdered, or the issue of reparations, things of that nature, everyone is, oh, that's wrong and something ought to be done. But both conservatives and liberals aren't willing to address it in that way. So we have to call both to account in that. And the only way we can do that is by having a voice in the public square, which means doing a radio show, which means writing an op-ed, which means publishing a book or newspaper articles. Have something to say, because for African Americans, when we get these degrees, we are, to use a Du Boisian kind of what he's accredited for, the terminology, the talented tenth. We are the ones who ought to be informed and ought to offer informed perspectives on the issue of the day.
Time goes by so fast. I'm really fast. Just one thing you can think of that you would leave with us and it would touch our soul and never ever forget what you're telling us today. Just one thing you can leave with us.
Keep the Bible. I think we are at risk of trying to be so deep that we lose our center. Keep the Bible, keep Jesus at the center. I'm of the mindset that if we throw it away for this deeper knowledge, then we lose that which encouraged our ancestors to sing in the hush harbors, to encourage our ancestors to march in the face of dogs and fire hoses, because they were inspired by a belief that God was on their side, that God was able to keep the Bible at the center and keep Jesus and Christianity.
And with that, we would not fear, because we'll be telling the truth. The truth is so important. And do not give up, because our community really, really need us right now. And they're looking up, like you said, they're looking at the Dr. Ball. And one thing about Maple Spring, I know we got 2 minutes. Maple Spring has always been, when I found out about Maple Spring, because I'm not from this area, found out about Maple Spring, it is one of the most well-kept secrets in this world. Maple Spring is one of the best Bible seminary that we would ever have. And that's what I just want to say. I'm saying this, that Maple Spring is one of the best. And every person I met who graduated from Maple Spring, and I'm so impressed with what they're receiving at Maple Spring. So may God continue to bless you in the position that you have, and continue to do the work that you've been doing for so long, but fire with it and changing people's lives because of you. May God continue to be with you.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, thank you so much. I know the time is so fast. Dr. Ball is special. God has placed him here to do so many different things, to open our eyes, to let us see that the Bible is truth. The Bible is truth. And we remember that. We don't have to keep changing because of terminology. We don't have to keep changing because other people tell us that we have to. We have to know the truth, and the truth is the Bible. So continue to pray But God will tell you what to do when you pray. And don't miss the whisper, that little quiet little voice sometimes that God whispered in our ears to do something and change our communities and our schools and our homes today. May God bless you.
God has spoken. Let the church say amen. Ooh, yeah, yeah. Make this your response to whatever he said. From the healing of your body to the raising of the dead.